Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 1st, 2020. Protesters attack U.S. Embassy in Iraq, chanting "Death to America." Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spoke by telephone with Mr. Abdul Mahdi and President Barham Salih in separate calls and made clear the United States will protect and defend its people, according to a summary of the call from the State Department. At the same time, Iran and the United States have been competing for political influence in the aftermath of the battle against the Islamic State, which once ruled large areas of Iraq. Iraqi militias, known as the Popular Mobilization Forces, were formed in part to help fight the Islamic State in tandem with the National Security Forces, a battle that effectively put them on the side of the United States. Science panel staffed with Trump appointees says EPA rollbacks lack scientific rigor. In each case, the 41 scientists on a board, many of whom were appointed by Trump administration officials to replace scientists named by the Obama administration, found the regulatory changes flew in the face of science. As for the proposal to limit scientific data in health regulations, the scientists wrote that key considerations that should inform the proposed rule have been omitted from the proposal or presented without analysis. The letters come as the Trump administration contends with mounting criticism that its policies have ignored, distorted, or marginalized scientific data at the expense of the environment, public health, and legal obligations. Ms. Scheinmeier, the EPA spokeswoman, said the new auto pollution rule will benefit all Americans by improving the U.S. fleet fuel economy, reducing air pollution, and making new vehicles more affordable for all Americans. Dr. John Gluckenheimer, a mathematician at Cornell, was appointed in 2019 to the EPA panel and worked on the analysis of the Trump administration's plan to replace the Obama-era water protection rule, known as Waters of the United States. Carlos Ghosn's escape, a lawyer in Beirut, a French passport, and a lot of mystery. Carlos Ghosn, the deposed chief of the Nissan and Renault auto empire, facing charges of financial wrongdoing, had fled to Lebanon, and no one in Japan, not the authorities, the media, or even the auto executive's own lawyer, could explain how it happened. On Twitter, Masahisa Sato, a lawyer, a member of the upper house of Japan's parliament and a former top foreign ministry official, asked whether Mr. Ghosn had the support of some country in his departure. Addressing the reporters outside his Tokyo office, Mr. Hironaka said Mr. Ghosn's departure was totally unexpected. There had been no sign that Mr. Ghosn was preparing to flee, Mr. Hironaka said. A simple investment strategy that worked in 2019. Buy almost anything. Broad indexes of the American bond markets are up nearly 9%. Analysts at Ned Davis Research tracked 8 types of investments: large and small domestic stocks, developed and emerging market stocks, treasuries, corporate bonds, commodities, and real estate, going back to 1972. For now, concerns about such market fundamentals seems to be set squarely on the back burner after the Fed reinvigorated risk-taking in the markets by cutting interest rates 3 times out of concern that the trade war and a global growth slowdown would drag the United States economy lower. FDA plans to ban most e-cigarette flavors but menthol. We have a very big industry. we're going to take care of the industry. With partial flavor ban, Trump splits the difference on vaping. The administration's decision is a partial retreat from a commitment it made in September to quickly devise a ban of all flavors except those that tasted like tobacco. Industry lobbyists seeking to protect flavors were joined by conservative organizations like Americans for Tax Reform, which opposed regulatory limits that they said would harm the small businesses that manufacture vaping flavors, retailers that sell them, and adult consumers of e-cigarettes. Reynolds American, which manufactures the Vuse e-cigarette, sought to exempt menthol and mint flavors from a ban, and the Vapor Technology Association, a trade group, had pressed to keep most flavors on the market. From the brig to Mar-a-Lago, former Navy SEAL capitalizes on newfound fame. In an email to his lawyer, Timothy Parlator said Chief Gallagher is happy to respond to inquiries by legitimate journalists looking to publish factual pieces, but has no time for propagandists who put out knowingly false statements masquerading as fact. On Instagram, the chief and his wife have been outspoken, touting both the president and the various consumer products they are backing. So many SEALs have published war stories and booked public speaking gigs in recent years that the satirical news site The Onion published an article announcing Navy forms elite new SEAL team to write best-selling tell-all books. But Chief Gallagher is the first to do it in the wake of a war crime court-martial, and the only one who has sought to tie his public persona so closely to a political party and a divisive commander-in-chief. Nike has their First Amendment right to make individuals such as Colin Kaepernick their brand ambassador. We have the right to make patriots, like Chief Gallagher, one of ours. 9 Lions promotional photos and videos for the new clothing line show Chief Gallagher shooting an AR-15 assault rifle. It's 50 below. The past is a horror show. You dream of escaping too. Like many young people in Magadan, a frigid northern Russian city more than 3,600 miles from Moscow, Dinat Yur is fed up with living in a place where winters drag on for 6 months and the average annual temperature is below freezing. Built on an icy bay overlooking the Sea of Okhotsk, north of Japan, Magadan is Russia's version of Dawson City, the Canadian town created by the Klondike Gold Rush at the end of the 19th century. To lift flagging spirits, municipal buses are emblazoned with a defiant statement of the city's will to survive. Magadan was, is, and will be. The phrase borrows inauspiciously from a less than successful Soviet-era slogan once plastered across the country. Lenin lived, lives, and will live. Because of the flight of young people, Magadan now has a severe shortage of able-bodied workers. French chef loses legal battle over a lost Michelin star. A court in France ruled on Tuesday against a celebrity chef who sued the Michelin Guide after its reviewers stripped his restaurant of one of its treasured 3 stars. 69 sued the guide in September in an effort to compel the dining guide to overturn reviewer notes that led to the downgrade, as well as the receipts from the meals. Officials from the guide met with the chef to explain the decision, but Gwendol Pulanek, the international head of the Michelin Guides, said that Mr. Veyrat's restaurant could not be removed entirely. North Korea is no longer bound by nuclear test moratorium, Kim says. In its New Year's Day edition, the North's main party newspaper, Rodong Sinmun, filled its front page with Mr. Kim's remarks, including an exhortation to his people to foil the enemy's sanctions. Mr. Kim, who had hoped to shift his focus to finally revving his country's economy, had been growing frustrated in recent months as his negotiations on denuclearization with the Trump administration have stalled. Mr. Trump, speaking in Florida on Friday night, cited the Singapore pledge and said he considered Mr. Kim to be a man of his word. "I know that he is sending out certain messages about a Christmas present," Mr. Trump added, reprising a line he had used before. "And I hope his present is a beautiful vase." But Mr. Kim's words on Tuesday were much harsher. Since taking over his country following the death of his father and his predecessor, Kim Jong-il, in 2011, Mr. Kim has accelerated his country's nuclear weapons and missiles program. Macron stands by contested pension plan, despite pressure from marathon strikes. Under pressure to resolve a crippling transport strike that is weighing on the lives of his countrymen, President Emmanuel Macron of France insisted Tuesday night that he was not giving up on a pension overhaul that has brought thousands of workers into the streets. Mr. Macron nonetheless hinted that there could be possible changes to his plan in order to get the striking rail and subway workers back to work. Still, on two essential points that continue to arouse the anger of the most hard-lined unions, the ones leading the strike, Mr. Macron showed no signs of giving ground. Merkel's New Year's speech calls for action on climate and tolerance. The coming decade will be a hopeful one if the people of Germany come together to fight climate change, support developmental. The coming decade will be a hopeful one if the people of Germany come together to fight climate change, support development in Africa, and thwart hate and anti-Semitism at home. Chancellor Angela Merkel told her nation on Tuesday in her 15th annual New Year's speech. Tuesday's New Year's address by Ms. Merkel may be her last. In its post-war history, the New Year's speech has not always gone without a glitch. Japan loves robots, but getting them to do human work isn't easy. Robots can perform simple tasks, but not tasks that require judgment or the ability to evaluate a change in a situation, said Toshiya Okuma, Associate Director of Global Strategy in the Robot Business Division of Kawasaki Heavy Industries, a leading Japanese developer of robotics that has long helped automate car factory assembly lines. More recently, according to the International Federation of Robots, Singapore, South Korea, and Germany have overtaken Japan in robots per worker. Real-world robots are regarded for the most part as benevolent and a kind of symbol of an advanced, technologically savvy society, said Jennifer Robertson, a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan and author of Robo Sapiens Japanicus, Robots, Gender, Family, and the Japanese Nation. Helping drive the interest in robots are concerns about the declining population in Japan, where births are at their lowest level since 1874. Apocalyptic scenes in Australia as fires turn skies blood red. In Sydney, where heavy smoke from fires has obscured the sun many days this summer, officials rejected calls to cancel the city's signature New Year's Eve fireworks display after the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales approved the celebration. On Monday night, a volunteer firefighter died after a phenomenon called a fire tornado, turbulence caused by extreme rising heat, in New South Wales caused a 10-ton fire truck to roll over. The firefighter, Samuel McPaul, 28, was expected to become a father in May. He was the third volunteer firefighter to die this fire season. The other two, who also died in an accident involving the fire truck, were fathers of young children. Trump warns Iran as risk of wider armed conflict grows. President Trump toughened his rhetoric toward Iran on Tuesday, saying the country would be held fully responsible for the attack by Iraqi demonstrators on the United States Embassy compound in Baghdad, an assault that Mr. Trump said was directed by Tehran. The Trump administration was treating the threat as a serious new escalation by Iran, 2 days after Mr. Trump approved the airstrikes against a militia group that American officials said launched a rocket attack on an Iraqi military base that killed an American contractor and wounded 4 American soldiers. Mr. Graham praised Mr. Trump on Twitter for acting decisively and told Iran that the president will hold you accountable for threats against the Americans and hit you where it hurts the most. He also issued a veiled threat of further military action, telling the Iranian government that a country that depends on the ability to refine oil for its existence needs to be cautious. Complicating the picture was what a senior Trump administration official who spoke on the condition of anonymity on Monday cast as longtime frustration with the Iraqi government, saying it has not sufficiently protected American military and diplomatic personnel from Iranian-backed militia groups. A couple unwittingly threw away $20,000. The dump gave it back. Without revealing what exactly had been discovered, the Avon and Somerset police interviewed the couple in their home and at a police station until they were satisfied that their account of events aligned with the property abandoned at the recycling center. No details of the discovery were disclosed to the couple. David Bowen, a police employee who worked on the case, said in a statement on Monday, adding that once the pair were interviewed, there was no doubt that the money belonged to them. The couple were not entirely surprised. They told the police that the dead relative had a habit of hiding money around the house. Angola freezes assets of ex-president's billionaire daughter. Ms. Dos Santos said the asset freeze ordered by a court was politically motivated, and that the case against her had been held in total secrecy. A court document dated December 23rd said the government believed Ms. Dos Santos, her husband Sindinka Docolo, and Mario Leite de Silva, chairman of Banco de Fomento Angola, had caused estate losses of more than $1 billion. The asset freeze applies to personal bank accounts of Ms. Dos Santos, Mr. Docolo, and Mr. de Silva in Angola, and stakes they hold in Angolan firms including Unitel, Banco de Fomento Angola, and Zap Media. Ms. Dos Santos is believed to live in Portugal and Britain and to have a significant portion of her wealth offshore. The most important week of the Democratic primary in 2019. What happened over the following days would reset the trajectory of the primary race. Mr. Biden stabilized. Ms. Warren and Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont began experiencing a reversal of fortunes. Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, drew a bead on Ms. Warren, and Senator Kamala Harris of California looked less and less like a formidable candidate. Mr. Shahid said that the former vice president has stayed away from the level of scrutiny he received during the first months of his campaign. Mr. Biden's permanence is real. His lead atop national polling averages has gone virtually unthreatened since Ms. Warren receded from her peak. In late September and early October, Mr. Biden struggled to respond to Mr. Trump's attacks against his son, Hunter Biden, and his business dealings in Ukraine, even though there was no evidence to support Mr. Trump's claim. Stolen research. Chinese scientist is accused of smuggling lab samples. Under questioning, court documents say Mr. Zhang acknowledged that he had stolen 8 of the samples and had replicated 11 more based on a colleague's research. Mr. Zhang booked another flight to China the following day, but was detained by FBI agents before he could board it, court documents say. Agents learned more when they visited Mr. Zhang's apartment, according to court documents. Impeachment trial looming. Chief Justice reflects on judicial independence. Chief Justice Roberts began his report, as is his custom, with a bit of history, recalling a riot at which John Jay, an author of the Federalist Papers and later the first Chief Justice, was struck in the head by a rock, thrown by a rioter motivated by a rumor. Jay and his colleagues, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, ultimately succeeded in convincing the public of the virtues of the principles embodied in the Constitution. Those principles leave no place for mob violence, Chief Justice wrote. Sorry, Chief Justice Roberts, but you do indeed have Obama judges, Mr. Trump wrote, and they have a much different point of view than the people who are charged with the safety of our country. On Tuesday, the Chief Justice returned to his theme. As just one example, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, the current Chief Judge of the District of Columbia Circuit has, over the past 2 decades, quietly volunteered as a tutor at a local elementary school, inspiring his court colleagues to join in the effort. That judge is Merrick B. Garland, who was nominated to the Supreme Court by President Barack Obama in 2016, but denied a hearing by Senate Republicans. Second Senate Republican questions impartiality of impeachment trial. Senator Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, criticized some of her Senate colleagues, including the majority leader, for appearing to prejudice the evidence in impeachment proceedings against President Trump, becoming the second Republican senator to question Senator Mitch McConnell's pledge to coordinate with the White House. With Ms. Collins and Ms. Murkowski doubting their leader's approach, scrutiny will fall on independent-minded Republicans like Senator Mitt Romney of Utah and retiring Republicans like Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who could force Republican and Democratic leaders to work out the terms of a trial the way they did in 1999 with the impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton. Senator Doug Jones, Democrat of Alabama and one of his caucus's most vulnerable members, said in an opinion article published Monday in the Washington Post that for Americans to have confidence in the impeachment process, the Senate must conduct a full, fair, and complete trial with all relevant evidence regarding the president's conduct. But while Mr. Schumer said in his opening proposal to Mr. McConnell that the issue of witnesses and documents should be determined before the trial begins, Ms. Collins said she would prefer to wait to decide who specifically should be called. Robert Durst, subject of the jinx, admits writing key note in murder case. Mr. Durst, who is scheduled to face trial in February, has long insisted that he did not kill Miss Berman, one of his closest friends, and did not write what has now become known as the cadaver note. In 2015, he told the producers of The Jinx, an HBO documentary that turned his story into a national sensation, that the writer of the note had taken a big risk because it was something that only the killer could have written. His defense lawyers had repeatedly tried to block testimony from forensic document examiners who say the handwriting of the note matches Mr. Durst's. Mr. Durst has been in jail since 2015, when he was arrested in New Orleans and charged with Miss Berman's murder, just hours before the final episode of The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, aired on HBO. The authorities said they suspected that he was about to flee the country. In interviews in 2015 and 2016 with the New York Times, one of Mr. Durst's friends, who requested anonymity out of fear of legal entanglements in the case, said Mr. Durst had privately acknowledged finding Miss Berman's lifeless body when he went to her home on December 23, 2000, and did not want her dogs to gnaw on it. Warren urges Democrats to imagine a better America and her as president. Marking a year since she began her campaign for president and seeking to frame the final 5-week sprint to Iowa, where much of her candidacy hinges, Senator Elizabeth Warren urged her supporters to imagine that something better lies on the other side of the chaos and ugliness of the last 3 years, in a major speech on Tuesday. In response to a question about what policy distinctions he had with Miss Warren, Mr. Sanders, who has been reluctant to criticize Miss Warren, noted that he would introduce his Medicare for All legislation in his first week as president. Miss Warren has vowed to pass an expansion of public health insurance in her first 100 days as president, but would wait as long as 3 years to push through a Medicare for All style universal system. Corey Lewandowski says he won't run for Senate in New Hampshire. Corey Lewandowski, the polarizing political operative who was President Trump's first 2016 campaign manager, said Tuesday he would not seek a United States Senate seat in New Hampshire, ending months of speculation about a run that has put some Republican state leaders on edge. Mr. Lewandowski helped Mr. Trump notch his first primary victory in New Hampshire in February 2016, which began Mr. Trump's march to the Republican presidential nomination. In a statement on Tuesday, a spokesperson for the New Hampshire Democratic Party sought to tie Republicans to Mr. Lewandowski and Mr. Trump even without Mr. Lewandowski in the race. Dizzying day for Trump caps a year full of them. Mr. Trump arrived at the $650 a person annual New Year's Eve party at his Mar-a-Lago resort shortly after 9 p.m. as a packed ballroom of guests, including his children, his personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, who wore a green and red bow tie, and a procession of local society notables, awaited him inside. Of course, there was impeachment, a big fat hoax, Mr. Trump said, something that has been engineered by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, whom he called a highly overrated person, over pounding drums and a chorus that made it difficult to hear his words. The president renewed his complaints that European leaders, including Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, had not done more to support Ukraine. As ever, the news media loomed particularly large in Mr. Trump's mind. About them, you feel bad, but then you realize that maybe it wasn't the best environment to work in. In an audio recording from one of the firings this week at Trump Winery, a manager told a worker named Omar Miranda that the company had completed a review of immigration paperwork and found his did not seem genuine or was insufficient. Do you currently have legal permission to work in the United States? The manager asked with the aid of interpreters. The president has touted himself as a champion of the American workers, signing a Buy American, Hire American executive order in 2017 to tighten the conditions for visas for foreign workers. Battling a demon. Drifter sought help before Texas church shooting. Mr. Kanunin came back to the church on Sunday, but this time he pulled out a shotgun during the communion service and fatally shot 2 parishioners, just before Mr. Wilson killed him with a single shot. Even church. Mr. Kanunin, who had a history of run-ins with the police and troubles with drug abuse and mental illness, was also a deeply religious man who often quoted from the Bible, his family and friends said, just the kind of person those at the church in the suburbs of Fort Worth had sought to aid. If you've never been a preacher, you don't understand that, but he was my best friend and he died saving lives. Though he had been to the church before, Mr. Kanunin aroused suspicion among members of the security team on Sunday when he walked in wearing a trench coat and what looked like a fake beard. Protect veterans from fraud. Congress has a lot more to do if it intends to curb these fly-by-night schools. For instance, by forcing the Department of Veterans Affairs to use the authority it already has to stop education fraud. On December 10th, for example, the Federal Trade Commission reached a $191 million settlement with the for-profit University of Phoenix to resolve charges that the school falsely promoted its educational benefits and used deceptive marketing materials that targeted active duty service members, veterans, and military spouses. And a year ago, Career Education Corporation, another for-profit college operator, agreed to forego more than $500 million in debt owed by former students to settle charges in 48 states and Washington, D.C., that it had preyed upon students with deceptive practices. A 2016 analysis by Yale Law School's Veterans Legal Services Clinic hammered the department for sitting on its hands, even though it had the authority to approve, disapprove, and suspend GI Bill funds for educational institutions that engaged in deceptive recruiting practices. Beyond that, the Yale team found the VA had declined to support or has even undercut state-level efforts to protect veterans from unscrupulous or non-compliant schools. Doctors, nurses, and paperwork crisis that could unite them. Nurse suicides are not systemically measured and reported, but a 2017 study in England found a suicide rate among nurses that was 23% above the national average. Physicians earn much more money than nurses and have much higher status in the medical hierarchy, which can lead to resentment from nurses when that higher status is abused. Doctors would be wise to let nurses take the lead. For years, nurses have organized to improve hospital working conditions, in particular, fighting for better staffing levels. A New Year's climate diet. There are smaller, maintainable changes that would allow carbon couch potatoes to go from carbon obese to just carbon overweight. If we switch to a vegan diet, we could cut out carbon dioxide emissions by 0.3 to 1.6 metric tons per person per year. Mangrove forests are one of the world's most powerful carbon sinks. Those in the Amazon store twice as much carbon per acre as the region's rainforest. Republican women are in crisis. As 2020 begins, Republicans have Miss Palin and her brand of right-wing populism, revived and carried on by Donald Trump, to blame for the endangered state of the Republican woman. In 2012, female voters outraged over Republican attacks on Planned Parenthood and access to birth control powered President Barack Obama to re-election and denied Republicans 2 winnable Senate seats. Mr. Trump took notice, tweeting, "A new Republican star is born." Yet not all female Republican politicians have thrown their lot in with the president. Was 2019 the best year ever? As an inveterate optimist, I appreciate Nicholas Kristof's emphasis on all the positive developments recent years have brought the global human population. So while Mr. Kristof offers a brief nod to the climate crisis, that fails to do justice to the fact that this year was one of the worst years ever for the planet. Mr. Kristof is right, of course. The past few decades have seen remarkable improvements in the standard of living across the world, and we should end 2019 with a feeling of thankfulness. On anti-Semitism in New York. Let New Yorkers respond as the people of Billings did. Transportation Authority to add more police officers to patrol the system instead of spending the money on improving service. It is heartening to read that serious crime in the subway continues to decline, but the general sense of lawlessness in the subway is most definitely not down. While I take your point about adding officers who report to a state-controlled authority that is less accountable to average New Yorkers, the New York Police Department has plenty of other fish to fry. The secret behind Amazon package delivery to West Africa. Every few weeks, Miss Wade stuffs her luggage with goods and hauls them across the Atlantic to the people who actually made the purchase, customers in Dakar, Senegal, and West Africa, who pay her a fee. Informal couriers like Miss Wade, 34, are known in Senegal and other French-speaking countries as GPs, Amazon ships goods to Senegal and 128 other countries, where it assumes the risk and responsibility for deliveries, much as it does in the United States, according to the company. Officer who admitted to making racist threats quits after an uproar. Miss Halliburton wants the NYPD to fire him immediately so that he can't hurt anyone else. The police department said last week that Officer Reynolds was on modified duty and that the disciplinary process was awaiting the Nashville case's conclusion. His actions are wholly inconsistent with the values and standards of the New York Police Department. The New York Police Department expects and demands of its officers. Officer Reynolds, 26, has apologized in court for the episode and claimed he had no memory of it because he had been drinking heavily. The only thing he remembered, he testified, was identifying himself as a police officer when speaking to a Nashville officer who answered Miss Halliburton's calls. Why abolishing bail for some crimes has law enforcement on edge. There are still a lot of unknowns. While New Jersey, California, Illinois, and other states have limited the use of bail, New York is one of the few states to abolish bail for many crimes without also giving state judges the discretion to consider whether a person poses a threat to public safety in deciding whether to hold him. Thousands of people currently in jail awaiting trial across the state will be automatically released, and about 90 cases have moved through the court. And about 90% of new defendants each year in New York will remain free as their cases move through the court. In recent weeks, courts around the state have begun releasing batches of defendants from jails under the new rules to avoid a rush as the new year starts. And the law's opponents have pounced on recent cases in which people out on bail committed crimes as harbingers of the future. Over a year after hurricane, recovery is a long process. These are the people the world doesn't get to see, the world doesn't get to know. But when they come here to volunteer, a lot of them know the individuals by name. They have built rapport with them. The Food Bank of Central and Eastern North Carolina usually operates through a network of partner agencies, which receive food from the bank and distribute it to their communities. The Trenton Pantry is the first time that Food Bank has worked on the front lines of food distribution. With the loss of electricity, her food spoiled, and she found herself relying on the food pantry. Carlos Ghosn, fugitive but a favorite son, returns to Beirut. We are all Carlos Ghosn, the text announced, declaring support for the man charged in Japan as a corporate titan gone bad. Now the actual Carlos Ghosn has materialized in Beirut, a flesh and blood fugitive somehow come home. It's not fair to put him in jail. Mr. Ghosn was born to a Lebanese family in Brazil, home to a large Lebanese diaspora community, and educated in Beirut and France, home to another. The legend of the car world is currently in cold, solitary prison, Mr. Karam said at the end, quoting the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Carlos Ghosn, Mr. Karam continued, you are not alone. On Tuesday, a private security guard stood outside the Pink Mansion, but Mr. Ghosn was nowhere to be seen. California wanted to protect Uber drivers. Now it may hurt freelancers. Who's going to hire me as an employee for 3 assignments a month? The new law, Assembly Bill 5, will radically reshape freelance work in California. AB 5 codified and extended the reach of a 2018 State Supreme Court ruling, that said workers must be classified as employees if the work they did was a regular part of the company's business. The new law also means that a company must treat workers as employees if it controls how they do their work, or if the workers don't run independent businesses in the same line of work that they do for the company. Carlos Ghosn's escape, what we know. Turkey detains pilots and Interpol issues red notice. Much about Mr. Ghazen's cinematic Carlos Ghazen's escape, what we know. Much about Mr. Ghazen's cinematic flight remains shrouded in mystery, including how he was able to escape surveillance in Japan, how he arranged his flight to Lebanon, and whether he was helped by other countries. Mr. Ghazen reportedly took a corporate jet from Osaka to Istanbul Ataturk Airport, and then switched planes and flew to Beirut, Lebanon, and on Thursday, authorities in Turkey were questioning 7 people, including 4 pilots and airport ground workers, in connection with Mr. Ghazen's escape, according to local media reports. What are Ghazen's complaints against the Japanese legal system? Mr. Ghazen has accused the courts and prosecutors in Japan of treating him unfairly. How cutting food stamps can add costs everywhere. For additional help, people often turn to local food pantries like those that partner with the Greater Boston Food Bank. 3 months in, the participants were less likely than those using a traditional food pantry to experience severe food insecurity. Feeding America, a national network of 200 food banks, estimates 1/3 of the households who use their affiliated food pantries have a member with diabetes. The Warriors get a new home and new neighbors. Before Chase Center opened in September in San Francisco's Mission Bay, developers knew the $1.6 billion basketball arena had to be more than the home of the Golden State Warriors. We had to construct a giant watertight enclosure below the arena, but it made it possible to have all 360 degrees on the street active. Chase Center and its broader development reflect the changing economics of sports. We're seeing a trend since the Great Recession that, with some notable exceptions, cities have been much less willing to open up a pocketbook and fund a stadium or arena, said Michael Leeds, a Temple University economics professor and co-author of The Economics of Sports. You're not going to cover expenses just 50 nights a year with basketball. So you really need something for the other 300 plus nights that's going to bring in some revenue. The Warriors initially planned to build the arena on another site to the north, Pier 30 to 32, which offered postcard views of the Bay Bridge. And that is Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 1st, 2020.